Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1869, when the dust of the Civil War had barely settled and Texas was still a wild frontier caught between worlds, 3 members of the Harlow family vanished from their ranch outside of Fort Griffin. What followed was a 20-year silence punctuated only by whispers, contradicting reports, and a trail of evidence so disturbing that much of it was sealed by local authorities until 1964. This is the account of what happened at Shadow Creek Ranch, pieced together from military correspondence, settler testimonies, and fragments of a journal that perhaps should have remained buried in the Texas soil. The Harlow homestead sat in a remote valley 30 miles northwest of Fort Griffin in what is now Shackelford County. The ranch was notable for its position, dangerously isolated even by frontier standards, situated near a small creek that disappeared underground during drought seasons. According to tax records from 1868, the property encompassed nearly 2,000 acres, though only a fraction was actively cultivated. The remaining land consisted of scrubland and limestone ridges that offered little agricultural value but provided natural barriers against unwanted visitors. Thomas Harlow, aged 42 at the time of the incidents, had acquired the land through a military land grant following his service in the Mexican-American War. Records indicate he had relocated from Virginia in 1859, accompanied by his wife Elizabeth and their 2 daughters, Sarah and Rebecca. County census data confirms the presence of 3 ranch hands and a housekeeper, though by early 1869, only 1 worker remained, a man identified in documents only as Maxwell, believed to be a former Confederate soldier. The daughters, Sarah and Rebecca, were young women by 1869, Sarah 21 and Rebecca 19, according to church records from Fort Griffin. Both had been educated through correspondence courses managed by their mother, a practice not uncommon for isolated frontier families. Neither had married, despite reaching ages when most frontier women had already established households of their own. The Harlow women were described in contemporary accounts as reserved in manner and pale of complexion, having spent much of their lives in relative isolation. On July 17, 1869, a supply wagon returning from Fort Griffin discovered the Harlow ranch unnaturally quiet. What they found inside the main house defied immediate explanation. The doors were unlocked. Dinner plates remained on the table, food half-eaten and hardened by time. A single oil lamp had burned itself out, leaving a trail of black soot up the wall. According to the wagon driver's sworn statement, not a living creature remained, not person, not livestock, not even the dogs. The only sign of disturbance was the back door, which stood open to the elements. Initial reports blamed Apache raiders, a convenient explanation that satisfied most authorities. However, inconsistencies emerged almost immediately. No blood was found anywhere on the property. No signs of struggle appeared in any room. Most tellingly, nothing of value had been taken. Silver cutlery remained in drawers, and Elizabeth Harlow's jewelry box sat untouched on her dresser. The disappearance became the first documented case in Shackelford County history to be classified as unexplained rather than as an Indian raid or criminal act. Captain James Morrison of the 4th Cavalry, who led the initial military investigation, noted in his official report that the absence of typical raid indicators suggests either an elaborate deception or circumstances beyond conventional explanation. His report included the unusual observation that the soil surrounding the property showed no tracks departing in any direction, as though the occupants had simply ceased to exist rather than fled or been taken. The ranch stood abandoned for nearly 2 years before being purchased by a cattle company. Workers sent to renovate the property reported such severe unease that many refused to stay after nightfall. The property changed hands 7 times between 1871 and 1890, with no owner maintaining residence for longer than 8 months. Local records show the final private owner, a James Buchanan, sold the property to the county for a fraction of its value in 1891, stating in the deed transfer only that the land remains unsuitable for habitation due to persistent conditions. A letter discovered in the Shackelford County Archives in 1958, written by Buchanan to his brother in Tennessee, elaborated on these conditions in troubling detail. The house itself seems to reject human presence. Sounds carry strangely within its walls. Conversations held in normal tones become inaudible, while whispers from distant rooms can be heard with unnatural clarity. The well water, though clear and seemingly pure, leaves a metallic aftertaste that persists for days. Livestock refuse to drink it. Most disturbing are the dreams that come to those who sleep there, dreams of vast underground chambers and figures moving in darkness. We have abandoned the attempt to make this place a home. In 1943, during excavation for a small dam project on the former Harlow property, workers uncovered a metal box buried beneath what would have been the ranch's barn. Inside were 27 pages of what appears to be Thomas Harlow's personal journal, covering the period from March to July 1869. The journal was briefly examined by local authorities before being transferred to the State Historical Society, where it remained largely untouched until a graduate student discovered it while researching frontier settlements in 1962. What follows is the most complete account ever assembled of the events at Shadow Creek Ranch, drawn from military records, local testimonies, and the fragmented journal that has been the subject of academic dispute for decades. Some names have been changed or omitted, where historical records remain unclear. Certain passages from the journal appear verbatim, though many entries are damaged or incomplete. The winter of 1868-1869 had been unusually severe by Texas standards. Heavy rainfall caused flooding along creek beds that had been dry for generations. Thomas Harlow mentioned the strange weather repeatedly in early journal entries, noting that the sound of water moving beneath the ground has become a constant companion. By March, the rain had stopped, but the creek near the property continued to flow at unusual strength. Harlow wrote that local Comanchero traders had refused to camp near the water, claiming it tasted wrong and made their horses nervous. An entry dated March 12, 1869 reads, "Found unusual tracks along the creek bed this morning, too large for coyote, wrong shape for bear, 5 toes with what appeared to be elongated nails or claws. Maxwell suggests a mountain lion, though I have never known such creatures to approach so close to human habitation without hunger driving them." The tracks led directly to the water and did not emerge on the opposite bank. By early April, Harlow noted changes in the behavior of his livestock. "The cattle no longer graze near the western ridge," he wrote on April 7th. "They crowd together in the eastern pasture, even when better forage is available elsewhere." Maxwell reports that the horses become agitated after sunset, particularly when facing the direction of the creek. Elizabeth suggests we sell the western acreage, though I cannot imagine who would purchase land that even animals avoid. Elizabeth Harlow, according to accounts from the housekeeper, who left their employment in April 1869, had begun to complain of headaches and disturbed sleep. She described hearing conversations beneath the floorboards at night, though she attributed this to the unusual acoustics of the valley. The housekeeper, identified in Fort Griffin church records as Mary Dennison, later told a local newspaper that she had left the Harlow employment after witnessing unnatural behavior in the household, though she refused to elaborate further. In a deathbed confession recorded by a Methodist minister in 1887, Dennison finally revealed what she had witnessed. "It was the girls that frightened me most. I found them one morning standing in the creek, water up to their waists, facing downstream with their backs to the house. They were perfectly still, not speaking or moving, just staring. When I called to them, they turned in perfect unison, but their expressions, it was as though they were looking through me rather than at me. They came out of the water and returned to the house without speaking." Their dresses were dry above the waterline, as though they had entered the water by some means other than walking. The neighboring Sutton Ranch, located approximately 17 miles east, reported that Thomas Harlow had appeared at their property in early May, seeking to purchase additional ammunition and inquiring whether they had seen any strangers watching the property lines. The Suttons described him as agitated but coherent, explaining that several head of cattle had gone missing without explanation. This was the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Harlow by anyone outside the immediate household. In his journal entry of May 10th, Harlow wrote, "Discovered a circle of stones on the western ridge this morning, not a natural formation. The rocks had been deliberately arranged in a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. At the center was a small depression in the soil, as though something heavy had rested there. No tracks approached or left the site. Maxwell refuses to discuss it, though I suspect he knows more than he admits. Elizabeth insists we should leave immediately. But where would we go? This land is all we have." A page dated May 18th contains a crude drawing of what appears to be a series of symbols found carved into a limestone outcropping near the property. Harlow noted that the markings do not correspond to any Indian signs known to me or to Maxwell, despite his extensive experience with frontier tribes. The cuts appear fresh, yet we have seen no strangers on the property. The symbols convey a sense of meaning just beyond comprehension, as though the mind recognizes a pattern it cannot quite grasp. By late May, Harlow reported that his daughters had begun sleepwalking. "Found Sarah standing in the kitchen last night, eyes open but unseeing," he wrote on May 23rd. "She was speaking softly, though not in any language I recognized. When I woke her, she had no memory of leaving her bed." Rebecca exhibited similar behavior 2 nights ago, though she was attempting to leave the house through the back door when Elizabeth discovered her. Maxwell, the remaining ranch hand, made his monthly trip to Fort Griffin on June 12th to collect mail and supplies. According to the general store ledger, he purchased twice the usual provisions, along with 3 new locks and a significant quantity of kerosene. The storekeeper recalled that Maxwell appeared troubled by something he wouldn't name, and mentioned that Thomas Harlow had begun setting lanterns around the property perimeter each night. When asked why, Maxwell reportedly answered, "To see what's been coming up from the creek after dark." In the town saloon that evening, Maxwell spoke briefly with a cavalry lieutenant stationed at Fort Griffin. According to the officer's personal correspondence, discovered among family papers in 1955, Maxwell inquired about the history of the land before white settlement. The lieutenant recalled telling him that the area had been considered boundary territory between Comanche and Apache groups, with neither claiming permanent residence there. Maxwell reportedly responded, "There's a reason they left it unclaimed. There's something in that valley older than any tribe." The most disturbing entries in Harlow's journal begin in late June. The handwriting deteriorates noticeably, with increasing pressure applied to the page and numerous crossed-out passages. On June 27th, he wrote, "E insists she heard Sarah speaking with someone in an unknown tongue last night. When confronted, the girl claimed she was merely talking in her sleep. I found strange markings in the dirt behind the barn this morning. Not Apache signs, something older." An entry from June 30th contains a passage that has particularly troubled researchers. Rebecca's journal contains drawings I cannot explain. Intricate patterns resembling the rock formations beneath the western ridge, though she has never explored that area to my knowledge. When questioned, she claimed the designs came to her in dreams of vast chambers beneath the earth where the old ones still speak. I have taken the journal from her, though she became uncharacteristically agitated at its removal. By early July, Harlow was sleeping in shifts with Maxwell, maintaining constant watch over the property. "Something approaches the house after midnight," he wrote on July 3rd. Not directly, but with a winding, patient movement that suggests intellect rather than animal instinct. The lanterns reveal nothing, yet we both hear the displacement of gravel, the subtle shifting of weight. It retreats before dawn, always toward the creek. On July 7th, he made a troubling observation about his wife. Elizabeth stood at the window for 3 hours today watching the western ridge. When I asked what she saw, she replied, "They're coming closer. They've accepted our invitation." She has no memory of making any such invitation, and became distressed when I recounted her words. The final legible entry, dated July 14, 1869, contains the passage that has confounded historians and researchers for decades. They watch from the ridge line. Not men. Not entirely. Maxwell claims they're Apache scouts, but their movements are wrong, too fluid, too patient. Elizabeth locked the girls in the root cellar after Rebecca tried to walk toward the creek last night, sleepwalking and speaking words that had no meaning. The knocking beneath the floorboards has grown louder. Something is rising from depths where it should have remained. We should never have settled this valley. The journal ends abruptly mid-sentence on the following page. I have decided we must leave at first light. Maxwell will prepare the wagon while The remainder of the text is illegible due to water damage. 3 days later, the supply wagon discovered the abandoned ranch. In the 20 years following the disappearance, numerous Apache bands were questioned by military authorities. None claimed responsibility for or knowledge of the incident at Shadow Creek Ranch. In fact, military correspondence from Fort Davis indicates that Apache groups had been deliberately avoiding the area around Harlow's property for at least a year before the disappearances, considering it a place of bad medicine. A Comanche scout working with the U.S. Cavalry reported in 1872 that tribal elders spoke of an ancient boundary near where the Harlow Ranch stood, a place where the below world sometimes rises to meet the above world. The statement was dismissed by military authorities as superstition, but was noted in the official report. Lieutenant Colonel William Shafter, who conducted a secondary investigation in 1873, included in his findings a statement from an elderly Apache medicine man who claimed that the water that flows underground in that place carries voices from another time. Those who listen too closely become hollow, and what fills them afterward is not human. In October 1871, a hunting party discovered what appeared to be a woman's boot print in dried mud nearly 15 miles from the abandoned ranch. Alongside it were unusual indentations described in the hunter's account as neither horse nor man, but something that walked on 2 legs with a dragging motion. The hunters followed the trail for several miles before losing it at a limestone outcropping. They reported their findings to authorities at Fort Griffin, but no official investigation followed. A local rancher named Ezekiel Wright claimed to have encountered Sarah Harlow in November 1871, more than 2 years after the family's disappearance. According to his sworn statement, preserved in county records, he was tracking stray cattle when he saw a young woman matching Sarah's description standing on a ridge approximately 10 miles from the former Harlow property. She was wearing the same blue dress seen in the family photograph circulated after their disappearance, Wright stated, but her skin had a gray cast to it, and she moved stiffly, as though unused to walking. When I called out, she turned toward me, but did not speak. Her eyes reflected the sunlight like an animal's eyes in darkness. Wright reported that he approached to within 20 yards before the woman turned and walked behind a large boulder. When he reached the spot seconds later, she had vanished. The terrain offered no hiding places, and the hard ground showed no footprints. Wright, described in local accounts as a man of practical disposition, not given to fanciful notions, was so disturbed by the encounter that he sold his property the following spring and relocated to New Mexico. Between 1880 and 1885, 3 separate accounts emerged from travelers claiming to have seen a woman matching Elizabeth Harlow's description walking along remote trails in the region. In each case, the woman was said to be wearing outdated clothing and appeared disoriented. When approached, she reportedly asked for directions to the underground water before disappearing into the landscape. The final such sighting by a cattle driver in 1885 added the detail that the woman's skin appeared unnaturally pale as though she had not seen sunlight in many years. The cattle driver, identified in local newspapers as Samuel Garretson, provided a detailed account of his encounter to the Fort Griffin Echo in December 1885. "She stepped out from behind a mesquite thicket as I was making camp," Garretson reported. Her dress was of a style not seen in these parts for many years, high-collared and formal, though tattered at the edges. What struck me most was her manner of speaking. Her words were clear enough, but the rhythm was wrong, as though she had forgotten how normal conversation flows. When I offered her food, she seemed not to understand the concept of eating. She asked repeatedly about the passage to the deep water, before walking away into the darkness. My horse refused to settle that night, and I heard something moving around my camp until dawn. The most compelling piece of evidence came in 1889, when a surveyor working for the railroad discovered a small cave entrance in a limestone formation approximately 7 miles from the former Harlow property. Inside, he found a child's shoe that matched the description of those known to have belonged to Rebecca Harlow. More disturbing were the markings on the cave walls, symbols that didn't correspond to any known Native American pictographs, but which bore striking resemblance to the strange markings Thomas Harlow had described in his final journal entries. The surveyor, William Chapman, made detailed notes about the cave system. "The entrance appears natural," he wrote, "but the interior shows signs of modification. Certain passages have been widened, while others have been deliberately narrowed with stacked stones. The air grows increasingly dense as one proceeds deeper, carrying a mineral scent I cannot identify. Most unusual is the acoustic property of the chambers. Sounds made in one area can be heard with perfect clarity in another, despite intervening solid rock." The cave was explored to a depth of nearly 200 feet, before narrowing to a passage too small for adult men to navigate. The surveyor reported hearing water moving in the darkness beyond, but no further exploration was attempted. In his official report, he noted that the air within the cave system had a quality that made breathing difficult and thinking unclear. The cave entrance was later sealed with dynamite on orders from the county authorities, officially due to concerns about structural instability. Chapman's personal diary, discovered among family papers in 1952, contained additional observations omitted from his official report. "I cannot shake the feeling that we were being observed throughout our exploration," he wrote. "Twice I turned suddenly, certain I had seen movement at the periphery of my lantern light." The other men reported similar experiences. On our final day of surveying, we all heard what sounded like a woman's voice calling from the unexplored passage, a voice that knew our names, though we had never announced them within the cave. By mutual agreement, we have decided to recommend sealing the entrance. An 1891 geological survey of Shackelford County included analysis of rock samples taken from the region surrounding the former Harlow property. The samples contained mineral compositions inconsistent with other formations in the area, suggesting a localized geological anomaly of unknown origin. Of particular interest was the presence of trace elements typically found only in deep oceanic trenches, despite the region's location hundreds of miles from any current or historical coastline. Professor Alan Whitaker of the University of Texas, who studied the Harlow case extensively in the 1960s, proposed that the family had likely fallen victim to a previously undocumented geological phenomenon. He suggested that natural gas seeping from underground deposits might have caused hallucinations and paranoia, eventually leading the family to flee their home in a state of confusion. This theory gained academic support, but failed to explain the numerous inconsistencies in the physical evidence. Whitaker's later research, however, took a more unconventional direction. In personal papers released after his death in 1966, he wrote, "The conventional explanation I provided publicly represents only a fraction of what I have come to believe about the Shadow Creek incident. The evidence increasingly suggests that the Harlow family encountered something beyond our current scientific understanding, something connected to the unusual hydrogeological features of the region. The underground water system appears to connect to a network far more extensive and far older than anything documented in standard geological surveys. A more controversial interpretation emerged from Dr. Margaret Shelton's 1965 paper, Liminal Spaces in Frontier Texas, which examined the Harlow case alongside other unexplained disappearances in the region. Shelton suggested that certain landscapes contain what she termed psychological trigger points, places where isolation, unusual geological features, and the stress of frontier life created conditions for shared psychosis among vulnerable populations. Her work was largely dismissed by mainstream academia, but developed a following among researchers of unusual historical cases. Shelton's private correspondence with Whitaker, unsealed in 1968, revealed that both researchers had arrived at similar conclusions about the Harlow case through different methodologies. What happened at Shadow Creek wasn't merely psychological, Shelton wrote in February 1965. The physical evidence suggests an actual encounter with something tangible, yet outside conventional understanding. The family didn't hallucinate their experiences. They encountered something real that operated according to principles we don't yet comprehend. What we know with certainty is that despite an official military investigation, multiple civilian search parties, and a substantial reward offered by the Texas Rangers, no trace of Thomas, Elizabeth, Sarah, or Rebecca Harlow was ever officially documented after July 17, 1869. Maxwell, the ranch hand, was briefly detained for questioning, but released due to lack of evidence. He later relocated to New Mexico Territory, where records indicate he lived as a near hermit until his death in 1904. A letter found among Maxwell's possessions after his death, never mailed and addressed simply to the authorities, contained a single paragraph that has become central to the mythology surrounding the case. What took the Harlows wasn't Apache, wasn't Comanche, wasn't any kind of man at all. It came from the places beneath Shadow Creek, where the water flows against nature's laws. I heard them speaking with it at night, heard how their voices changed when they answered. By the end, they weren't the same people who hired me. Their eyes had changed. They knew things they shouldn't have known. They wanted to go down to it. The letter was filed with other case documents and largely forgotten until Whitaker's research in the 1960s brought it back to academic attention. An additional page, separated from the main letter and discovered only during archival reorganization in 1968, contained a more detailed account. Thomas found something in the creek bed after the floods, a stone object with markings I cannot describe. He kept it in his study. After that, the changes began, first in him, then in the others. They spoke differently, moved differently, began to avoid daylight. I heard them at night, moving around the house with strange, fluid steps. Sometimes I heard them speaking with something else, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a voice like water moving through rock. They called it the dweller below. On the last night, I heard the girls singing an impossible melody, notes that shouldn't fit together, that no human throat should produce. I left before dawn. May God forgive me, but I knew what was coming for them, and I knew it wasn't meant for me. In 1892, the county converted the former Harlow property into grazing land, demolishing what remained of the original structures. Workers reported finding unusual stone arrangements in the root cellar, concentric circles of small limestone rocks surrounding what appeared to be animal bones. The county supervisor ordered the cellar filled with concrete before construction continued. His notes indicate this was done to prevent further unwholesome speculation about the property's history. One worker, Joseph Miller, later claimed in a local tavern that they had found something else in the cellar, a small chamber beneath the main floor accessed through a narrow passage. His account, recorded by the tavern owner's son in 1910, described a room no bigger than a closet, walls covered with those same symbols found in the cave. In the center was a shallow pit filled with dark water that seemed to move of its own accord, even without any air flowing through the space. The foreman ordered it filled with rocks and concrete, and told us never to speak of it. The creek that once ran near the Harlow home dried up completely by 1900, its course altered by drought and subsequent erosion. Today, the former Shadow Creek Ranch is part of a privately owned cattle operation, its specific location unmarked on modern maps. The current owners have consistently denied requests from historians and researchers to examine the property, citing privacy concerns and a desire to let old stories remain in the past. In 1962, during research for his doctoral dissertation, Whitaker attempted to locate any living connections to the Harlow family. His inquiries led to a nursing home in San Antonio, where he interviewed Abigail Collins, 94 years old and claiming to be the niece of Elizabeth Harlow. According to Whitaker's notes, the elderly woman became severely agitated when asked about her aunt's disappearance, repeatedly stating, "They didn't disappear. They went below. They're still there, walking in the dark water." Collins told Whitaker that her mother, Elizabeth's sister, had received a letter from Elizabeth dated August 1869, a month after the family's disappearance. The letter reportedly contained only a few lines. "We have found the passage to the deep places. The daughters are already changed. Thomas and I will follow. Do not look for us in the world above." Collins claimed that her mother burned the letter immediately after reading it and forbade any mention of the Harlow family thereafter. Collins died 3 weeks after the interview. Among her personal effects was a small tin box containing a brooch identified as matching one seen in the only surviving photograph of Elizabeth Harlow. Also in the box was a piece of limestone etched with symbols identical to those described in the surveyor's report from 1889. Whitaker included photographs of these items in his dissertation, but noted that the artifacts themselves had been misplaced during the settlement of Collins's estate. In a personal journal entry dated October 3, 1962, Whitaker wrote, "The symbols on the limestone fragment match not only those from the cave system, but also obscure petroglyphs found in certain deep caverns in the American Southwest. Preliminary linguistic analysis suggests they may represent one of the oldest known symbolic systems in North America, predating any known Native American writing system by thousands of years. What troubles me is not just their antiquity, but their consistency across vast geographical distances, as though they emerged from a single source deep in prehistory." Perhaps the most unsettling development in the case came in 1964, when a soil analysis conducted as part of an agricultural survey revealed unusual mineral concentrations in the area surrounding the former Harlow property. The water table beneath the land contained trace elements typically found only in much deeper geological formations, suggesting an underground connection to previously unknown aquatic systems. The survey team reported equipment failures and unexplained audio interference when working near certain limestone formations on the property. The lead geologist noted in his private correspondence, later donated to the University of Texas Archives, that team members experienced unusual auditory phenomena when working near the sealed cave system, describing it as the sensation of hearing conversations just beyond the range of comprehension. 3 team members requested reassignment during the 2-week survey period. The project's final report omitted these details, focusing instead on the agricultural potential of surrounding areas. Dr. Raymond Kirsch, a hydrologist who reviewed the geological data in 1966, proposed that the region contained an unmapped aquifer system potentially connecting to much deeper subterranean networks. The chemical composition of water samples suggests contact with mineral formations not known to exist in the region, he wrote. More concerning is the presence of organic compounds that cannot be readily identified using current analytical methods. Whatever flows beneath that land is not merely water in the conventional sense. The most recent significant development occurred in 1967 when severe flooding briefly reopened part of the cave system discovered in 1889. 2 local teenagers exploring the area reported finding a leather-bound book in a small air pocket approximately 50 feet from the entrance. Water damage had rendered most pages illegible, but partial text on the cover suggested it might have been a personal diary. Before authorities could examine the item, a second flood surge caused a cave-in that once again sealed the entrance. Recovery efforts were abandoned after 2 rescue workers reported extreme disorientation and presence sensations while attempting to clear the blockage. One of the teenagers, Michael Thornton, was interviewed by a local newspaper reporter shortly after the incident. The book had a name written inside the cover. He stated, "It looked like R. Harlow, but the ink was smeared." The few pages we could read talked about voices in the water and the ancient ones who wait below. There was a drawing that looked like a map of tunnels or caves with a circular chamber marked at the center. The writing got stranger toward the end, like the person was losing their grip on English. The last legible part said something like, "I can hear them clearly now. They have always been here, beneath the world we thought we knew." The reporter who conducted the interview, David Landon, attempted to pursue the story further, but found himself reassigned to sports coverage by his editor. In a letter to Professor Whitaker dated September 1967, Landon wrote, "I'm convinced there's more to the Shadow Creek story than has ever been made public. Local officials seem determined to suppress any new information about the cave system or the Harlow disappearance. The teenagers who found the diary have suddenly become reluctant to discuss their discovery, and the diary itself has supposedly been lost in transit to the County Historical Society." What actually happened to the Harlow family remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in Texas history. The official position of the Texas Historical Commission categorizes the case as probable victims of frontier violence, but this explanation satisfies few who have studied the evidence in detail. The absence of violence indicators, the strange journal entries, and the consistent reports of unusual phenomena in the area all suggest something far more complex and perhaps more terrifying than a simple raid or criminal act. Those who have walked the ridgelines near where Shadow Creek Ranch once stood often report an unusual acoustic quality to the landscape, a way that sounds carry unnaturally across the valleys or seem to emerge from the ground itself. Local ranchers still avoid certain limestone formations after dark, maintaining a tradition whose origins they may not fully remember. A retired sheriff's deputy, interviewed anonymously for a regional folklore collection in 1970, stated, "There are places out near the old Harlow land where the ground doesn't sound right when you walk on it, hollow in a way that makes no sense given the terrain. Old-timers used to say that if you put your ear to the ground in those spots on certain nights, you could hear voices speaking words that almost make sense. My grandfather called it the Whispering Land and warned us never to listen too closely or for too long." The water that once flowed visibly through Shadow Creek has long since disappeared from the surface, but geological surveys confirm it still moves beneath the ground, through channels and caverns unmapped and unexplored. In the words of Professor Whitaker, whose health declined rapidly after completing his research on the case, some frontiers were never meant to be settled. Some boundaries were marked for reasons we have forgotten. The Harlows found something older than America, older than any human claim to the land, and whatever they found, it took them as its own. Whitaker's final notes on the case, found among his papers after his death, contain a troubling observation. "I believe I now understand what happened to the Harlow family. They did not leave their ranch, they did not die, in any conventional sense. They found a point of contact with something that exists alongside our world but separate from it, something that reaches up through water and stone, that speaks in voices almost human, that can change those who listen too closely. The Harlows did not disappear, they were transformed." The final photograph of the Harlow family, taken approximately 3 months before their disappearance, shows 4 figures standing before their ranch house. Thomas stands stiffly in period formal wear, his expression unreadable behind a full beard. Elizabeth's face is partially obscured by camera motion. The 2 young women, Sarah and Rebecca, stand slightly apart from their parents. Close examination of the image, enhanced by photographic techniques unavailable to earlier investigators, reveals an unusual detail that has fueled decades of speculation. All four subjects appear to be looking at slightly different angles, as though each is watching something the others cannot see. In 1968, the Texas Historical Commission officially classified the Harlow disappearance case as closed due to insufficient evidence and passage of time. The files were archived, the journal fragments sealed in climate-controlled storage, and the strange story of Shadow Creek Ranch was left to academic footnotes and regional folklore. But in the limestone hills northwest of Fort Griffin, where the underground water still flows through darkness toward destinations unknown, local residents sometimes speak of lights seen moving across uninhabited ridgelines. They tell of sounds that might be voices carried on the wind from impossible distances. And they warn their children to avoid certain ancient paths where the ground sometimes sounds hollow beneath their feet, places where, as one local rancher put it in a 1966 interview, the world we know sits too lightly upon whatever waits below. A geology student conducting field research in the area in 1968 reported hearing what sounded like a woman's voice calling from inside a limestone formation, a voice that addressed him by name, despite his being alone and new to the region. His field notes, submitted as part of his thesis work, described a sensation of being watched by something ancient and patient, something that has existed in darkness for longer than human memory. In the archives of Fort Griffin, among documents rarely accessed by modern researchers, there exists a deposition taken in 1875 from a Comanche elder identified only as Black Horse. His statement, translated by a military interpreter, contains a warning about the land where Shadow Creek Ranch once stood. Before any tribe rode these plains, the old ones lived beneath the earth. They spoke through water and stone. They could wear human forms when they wished to walk in the upper world. My grandfather's grandfather knew not to drink from certain waters or to build lodges in certain places. The white settlers do not know these boundaries. They build where no one should dwell. They listen to voices they should not hear. The old ones are patient. They do not die as we die. They wait in the deep places. The Harlow family vanished without explanation in the summer of 1869. Whether they fled in fear, were taken by human hands, or encountered something beyond conventional understanding remains unresolved, but their disappearance opened questions about what might exist in the spaces between documented history, in the silences of remote places where the line between natural and unnatural can blur beyond recognition. As Maxwell wrote in his unsent letter, found decades after the events it described, some things should stay buried, some waters should remain undrunk. The Harlows drank too deeply of Shadow Creek. Whatever they found there, it claimed them. And sometimes, on nights when the wind blows from the northwest, I still hear them calling names that no human tongue was meant to speak. The land where Shadow Creek Ranch once stood appears unremarkable today. The limestone ridges remain. The underground water still flows. And in the silences between the calls of coyotes and nightbirds, some say other sounds occasionally emerge, sounds that might be dismissed as wind or settling earth, except for how they sometimes organize themselves into patterns that almost, but never quite, resolve into words. In 1971, Dr. Eliza Montgomery of the University of Texas conducted a hydroacoustic survey of the region using then-new technology to map underground water systems. Her findings were never officially published, though portions appeared in a specialized geological journal in 1972. According to her data, the waterways beneath the former Harlow property connect to a network of submerged caverns extending far deeper than typical limestone formations in the region should allow. Most notably, her equipment detected what she termed anomalous acoustic signatures within the deepest accessible chambers, rhythmic vibrations that computer analysis suggested had properties more consistent with vocalization than with natural water movement. Montgomery's research assistant, Richard Denton, later reported that the team experienced equipment failures whenever they attempted to record these acoustic anomalies. Tapes would erase themselves overnight, he noted in correspondence with Whitaker's successor at the university. Digital recordings would become corrupted. Film would fog. The professor eventually concluded that whatever generated those sounds existed at frequencies or energies that our equipment simply couldn't capture, like trying to photograph ultraviolet light with standard film. The assistant's field notes, preserved in university archives, contain a disturbing personal observation. During our final week of research, I began dreaming of dark water and stone passages. In the dreams, I hear voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension, voices that seem to know my name and thoughts. The professor reports similar experiences. We've agreed to conclude the field research earlier than planned. Some things, perhaps, aren't meant to be recorded or studied too closely. A local historian, Samuel Hayes, compiled oral histories from longtime residents of the region between 1970 and 1975. His collection, housed in the Shackelford County Historical Society, contains numerous accounts of unusual experiences near the former Harlow property. One elderly rancher, whose family had grazed cattle in the area since the 1880s, reported, "My father told me about the night watches they used to keep when moving herds through that valley. Men would take turns staying awake, not because of rustlers or predators, but because of what they called the visitors. They'd see figures moving on the ridgelines at night, tall, slender shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk. Never came close to the camp, just watched. By morning they'd be gone, but you'd find those strange circular patterns pressed into the grass where nothing would grow afterward." A woman whose grandfather had participated in one of the original searches for the Harlow family told Hayes, "Granddad wouldn't talk about what they found in the hills. Only once, when he'd had too much whiskey on his birthday in '95, did he mention it. Said they followed tracks up a dry wash, tracks that started as boot prints but gradually changed shape, becoming something no Christian man could explain. They found a cave entrance where the tracks led inside. 3 men went in, only 2 came out, and neither would say what happened to the third. Granddad said they sealed the cave with dynamite the next day and swore never to speak of it." In 1974, construction workers expanding a county road approximately 5 miles from the former Harlow property uncovered a small cave entrance. Inside, archaeologists found pottery fragments, carbon dated to approximately 8,000 BCE, far older than any previously documented human habitation in the region. More puzzling were the designs painted on the cave walls, intricate geometric patterns surrounding humanoid figures with elongated limbs and oversized eyes. According to the archaeological report, these figures appeared to be emerging from or descending into stylized representations of underground water sources. Dr. Catherine Reeves, who led the archaeological team, noted that the symbolism suggests a culture with an unusually developed relationship to subterranean water systems, possibly viewing them as passages to another realm or dimension. Most striking was the chemical composition of the pigments used in the paintings. They contained trace elements matching those found in the anomalous water samples taken from beneath the Harlow property in 1964. The most controversial aspect of Reeves's findings was a small chamber at the rear of the cave system, where her team discovered a stone tablet bearing symbols identical to those reported in Thomas Harlow's journal and seen in the cave discovered in 1889. "The correspondence is too precise to be coincidental," Reeves wrote in her preliminary report. "Either these symbols represent an unknown writing system that survived unchanged for millennia, or the later instances were deliberate copies of this ancient original. Both possibilities raise disturbing questions about the transmission of this knowledge across vast spans of time. The cave was designated as a protected archaeological site, but before comprehensive documentation could be completed, a flash flood in the spring of 1975 caused a partial collapse that rendered it inaccessible. Attempts to reopen the entrance were abandoned after structural engineers deemed the remaining passages unstable. Reeves later wrote that she considered the timing of the collapse conveniently unfortunate, suggesting that certain aspects of the region's history seem resistant to thorough investigation. In 1978, a graduate student researching frontier medical practices discovered an unusual document in the archives of a San Antonio hospital. Dated September 1869, the report described a patient admitted with severe disorientation and physical anomalies, who claimed to be Thomas Harlow of Shackelford County. According to the attending physician's notes, the man exhibited dermatological characteristics inconsistent with normal human tissue, a translucence to the skin that revealed underlying structures with unnatural clarity. The patient reportedly spoke in fragmented sentences interspersed with sounds that defied transcription, and demonstrated hydrophilic behavior, attempting repeatedly to submerge himself in any available water. Most disturbing was the physician's observation that the patient's physical condition appeared to be actively transforming rather than deteriorating, with changes to skeletal structure and tissue composition occurring at a rate visible to the observing eye. The report ended abruptly, noting only that the patient escaped containment during a severe thunderstorm 3 days after admission. A marginal note, added in different handwriting, stated simply, "Patient returned to water. Case closed by order of Dr. Barsilegible." The graduate student who discovered this document, Marion Lewis, attempted to locate additional records related to the case but found that relevant hospital archives from that period had been destroyed in a fire in 1892. Lewis included the finding in her dissertation but described it as historically problematic, noting that no other evidence existed to confirm that Thomas Harlow survived beyond the family's disappearance in July 1869. In private correspondence with Dr. Reeves, however, Lewis wrote, "I believe the San Antonio case was genuine. The medical details are too specific, too unusual to be fabricated, especially given medical knowledge of the period. Something happened to the Harlow family, something that changed them in ways 19th century science couldn't comprehend." Throughout the 1980s, sporadic reports emerged from ranchers and hunters in Shackelford County describing unusual phenomena near the old Harlow property. Unexplained lights moving along ridgelines, livestock refusing to approach certain areas, the sensation of being watched while moving through remote valleys. Local authorities typically dismissed these accounts as imagination or misidentification of natural phenomena. A sheriff's deputy interviewed for a regional newspaper in 1983 stated, "People out here know the old stories and see what they expect to see. A coyote becomes something walking upright. Wind through limestone becomes voices. The human mind creates patterns from random input." Yet some encounters defied such rational explanation. In 1985, a geology professor from Texas Tech University was conducting a routine survey of the region when he reported seeing what appeared to be a human figure composed partially of flowing water standing on a limestone outcropping. The figure reportedly maintained its shape for approximately 20 seconds before dissolving and flowing into crevices in the rock. The professor, described by colleagues as methodical and skeptical by nature, included the observation in his field notes with the comment, "I report what I observed without explanation or speculation." The phenomenon was visible, maintained coherent form temporarily, and disappeared in a manner inconsistent with known physical properties of water or light. In 1988, the Texas Water Commission conducted a comprehensive study of aquifers throughout the state. Their report identified the subterranean water system beneath the former Harlow property as anomalous in composition and behavior. Water samples contained mineral concentrations inconsistent with surrounding geology and organic compounds that defied conventional analysis. James Wilson, who led the hydrological survey, noted in his findings that water from the deepest accessible portions of the system exhibited properties not fully consistent with H2O as conventionally understood. In particular, he documented its unusual surface tension and light refractive qualities, concluding that the liquid appears to contain or consist of a previously unclassified compound with properties between those of water and a non-Newtonian fluid. The Commission recommended further study, but funding was redirected following a state budget crisis. Most notably, the report documented unusual temperature variations within connected chambers, areas where water remained at a constant 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of ambient conditions, precisely matching normal human body temperature. Dr. Wilson later told colleagues that he was relieved when the project was terminated. In his personal journal, portions of which were published after his death in 2001, he wrote, "Some aspects of nature resist classification or understanding. Perhaps this is not a failure of science, but a necessary boundary, a warning that certain knowledge carries costs we aren't prepared to bear. What flows beneath that land may be water, but it's water that has been changed by contact with something else, something that may in turn change those who study it too closely." In 1992, a documentary filmmaker named Robert Chandler began researching the Harlow case for a planned series on unsolved Western mysteries. During preliminary location scouting, his three-person crew spent a night camping near the former Harlow property. According to statements given to local authorities, they were awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds like whispered conversations coming from all directions simultaneously. Their recording equipment captured only static, but all three reported hearing clearly articulated words in an unknown language. Most disturbing was their shared experience of seeing what appeared to be human figures composed of flowing darkness, moving along the ridgeline above their camp. Chandler described them as vaguely female in form, but moving with a fluidity impossible for normal human anatomy. The figures reportedly made no attempt to approach the camp, but seemed to be observing the crew from multiple vantage points simultaneously. At dawn, they disappeared. The crew discovered that their vehicles would not start, forcing them to hike 8 miles to the nearest ranch. Chandler abandoned the project shortly afterward, citing personal reasons. In 1995, following unusually heavy spring rains, a sinkhole opened on private land approximately 3 miles from the former Harlow property. The property owner, investigating the collapse, discovered an entrance to a previously unknown cave system. He reported hearing strange sounds like singing coming from deep within the passages and contacted local authorities rather than exploring further. A team from the State Geological Survey conducted a preliminary assessment and found evidence of an extensive underwater cave network connected to the aquifer system that had been partially mapped in previous studies. The survey team's report noted unusual acoustic properties within the cave system, areas where sound seemed to propagate in defiance of normal physics, creating what they termed impossible echoes that returned more complex than the original sounds. More concerning were their accounts of experiencing shared auditory hallucinations while working in the deeper chambers, the distinct impression of hearing voices engaged in conversation, though no words could be clearly distinguished. The property owner, disturbed by these findings and by his own experiences near the sinkhole, requested that the entrance be sealed. County records indicate that concrete was poured into the opening in June 1995, and the area was designated unsafe for development. The owner later sold the property at a significant loss and relocated to Oklahoma, refusing all requests for interviews about his experiences. In 1996, a historian researching the Harlow case discovered military correspondence suggesting that the initial investigation in 1869 had been more extensive than publicly acknowledged. A letter from Captain Morrison to his superior officer, dated August 1869, requested specialized personnel familiar with unusual phenomena and referenced discoveries of a sensitive nature that would not be included in official reports. The letter specifically mentioned artifacts of unknown origin and evidence of activities inconsistent with known tribal practices or natural processes. No record exists of a response to this request, and subsequent military reports make no mention of these findings. When the historian attempted to locate additional documents related to Morrison's correspondence, she was informed that relevant archives had been reclassified in 1907 and were no longer accessible through normal channels. Her Freedom of Information Act request was denied on grounds that no such documents existed in current military archives. The most recent significant development came in 2001, when advanced ground-penetrating radar was used to map portions of the former Harlow property as part of a broader geological survey. The results revealed an extensive network of caverns and water channels beneath the surface, far more complex than previous surveys had indicated. Most notably, the data showed what appeared to be artificial modifications to certain underground chambers, straight-line edges, and geometric arrangements inconsistent with natural cave formation. Dr. Michael Reynolds, who analyzed the radar data, wrote in his report, "The subterranean structures suggest deliberate engineering on a scale difficult to reconcile with 19th century technology or known Native American practices. Either we are observing natural formations that coincidentally resemble artificial structures, or someone, or something, has been modifying the underground environment in this region for purposes we can only speculate about." Reynolds recommended a comprehensive survey using more advanced equipment, but his proposal was rejected as prohibitively expensive and potentially hazardous, given the unstable nature of the limestone formations. In private correspondence with colleagues, he expressed frustration at the decision, writing, "Every attempt to fully document what exists beneath that land seems to encounter either technical obstacles or administrative resistance. It's as though the truth about this place actively resists discovery." Today, the Harlow disappearance remains officially classified as an unsolved historical mystery, presumed to be the result of frontier violence or natural disaster. Academic interest in the case has waned in recent decades, with few researchers willing to navigate the complex mix of fragmentary evidence, folklore, and apparent scientific anomalies that surrounds it. Yet for those who have studied the case in depth, questions persist. What actually happened to Thomas Harlow and his family on that summer night in 1869? What connection exists between their disappearance and the unusual properties of the land they settled? Why do similar reports of strange phenomena continue to emerge from the region more than 150 years later? Perhaps most disturbing is the pattern that emerges across decades of documentation. Those who investigate too deeply often abandon their research abruptly, citing personal reasons or professional redirection. Those who persist frequently report unusual dreams, sensory experiences, or a growing sense of being observed by something that remains just beyond perception. As one researcher wrote in a journal entry shortly before withdrawing from a planned examination of the cave systems, "I've begun to understand why this case remains unsolved after so many years. It's not that the evidence doesn't exist or that the truth is unknowable. It's that something doesn't want it known, something that has been waiting in darkness since before human memory, something that speaks through underground waters in voices almost familiar, something that watches from limestone ridges when the sun sets over West Texas." The land where Shadow Creek Ranch once stood appears unremarkable today. The limestone ridges remain. The underground water still flows. Words that might be names. Words that might be invitations. Words that whisper of deep places where ancient things still dwell, watching and waiting for those who might listen too closely, who might follow the sounds to their source, who might drink from waters never meant for human consumption. In his final known writing about the case, Professor Whitaker perhaps came closest to the truth that has eluded so many. The Harlow family didn't vanish without explanation. They vanished because they found an explanation, an answer to questions humans aren't meant to ask, a truth we aren't equipped to comprehend. And having found it, they became something other than what they were. Not dead, not gone, just changed, and still there, beneath the ground in the dark water, waiting.